Welcome back to Slightly Tofu, the podcast that is tragically still not about soil products, but is 100% about making life a bit harder for exploitative industries. My name is Q, and today I'm very happy to be joined again by Fernando. We first met this summer at the Copenhagen Animal Liberation Conference, where he gave us a talk about the intersections between war, human oppression, and animal oppression. And I remember being really moved by it, even if, to be completely honest, I have forgotten a lot of the details, which is exactly what this episode is for, to revisit these conversations. And some of you might remember Fernando from a previous episode of Slightly Tofu International, where we talked about Colombia's path towards prohibiting bullfighting, his vegan advocacy work in Colombia, and some of the mistakes and lessons along the way. Our listeners found it fascinating to hear about doing animal advocacy in a context marked by deep inequality, generational trauma, and ongoing human rights and environmental violations, something that in a different way also resonates with experiences in other parts of the global south, including China. So today we're going to pick up that thread and go deeper into how systems of violence connect, war, poverty, state violence, and the way animals are folded into all of that, and what that means for strategy and hope in our movements. So, Fernando, for listeners who don't yet know about your work, could you briefly introduce yourself? Tell us a bit about your vegan origin story and how you ended up founding what I understand is the first ethical vegan organization in Colombia.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. So I was born and raised in Bogota, Colombia. That's the capital city. And it's central Colombia, high in the mountains. And I got involved when I was about 19 years old. I got involved in anti-bullfighting. And from there, I started questioning my own use of animals mostly for food, and I decided to go vegan, and I stopped eating meat overnight, and I was vegetarian for about 6 months, and then I went vegan, and I found that there was not a lot of people were vegan. Like only a few of my friends knew about it. Even the people who were involved in anti-bullfighting were not vegan, and we decided with one of my best friends to start an organization that talked about veganism, because we felt that there was a lot of talk about animal welfare. There were animal welfare groups and anti-bullfighting groups and anti-circus groups, but nobody was talking about like the meat industry and everything that entails. So that's how we started, and we think we were the first people to talk about veganism in Colombia as an ethical stance, not just like I assume there were vegans in Colombia, but there were maybe there were like religious affiliations or things like that. We were the first people to talk about like animal exploitation in that sense.
When you mentioned you were in the anti-bullfighting campaigns, could you describe the moment when you decided to go vegan? Was it because of a book, because of a conversation? Was there ever anyone that mentioned, you are here protesting against bullfighting? What about other animals?
Yeah, so I remember that moment because I think it's one of the most significant moments of my life. We were not even trying to ban the bullfight at the time because we thought that was like a very big ask. So we were asking the city to make the bullfight only for adults, because you can bring kids, or you could bring kids to a bullfight any age. And I was giving leaflets outside of the bullfighting arena, and it was not even somebody in the protest that talked to me. It was a bystander just came, and I gave him a leaflet, and he asked me, what are you doing? And I told him we're trying to make the bullfight an adult event. And he asked me if I ate meat, and I said yes. And he said, why are you standing here defending animals and then you go home and eat animals. And I remember literally he said, you're standing here defending animals and then you go home and stab animals in the back. And I don't know if that person wanted to discredit me or what we were doing, or I don't know if maybe he was vegan or nothing. Like, he just told me, think about it, and left. And it was like maybe 30 seconds. And after that, I started thinking, well, this person's right. Like, if I'm going to defend one animal, I should defend all animals. So that's when I decided to go vegan. About a week later, I stopped eating meat.
But sometimes I wonder, there must be other members in that campaign who would also be asked similar questions, but they might think, well, cattle or pigs or whatever, chicken, they are being bred just for food, right? We hear this very often, that these animals are, they're just being brought into existence because they're food. But you didn't have that kind of mental gymnastic at that time. I wonder, have you ever thought about why did you not feel defensive about a question like this and decided to adopt such a drastic change?
Well, it has to do with the same conversation. I remember when the person asked me, why are you standing here defending bulls and not every other animal? I said, because there's a difference between killing animals for fun, for entertainment, and killing animals for food. That person said something like, well, animals don't know why you're doing what you're doing. And I thought, wow, they're right. Like, the difference only exists in your head. But an animal doesn't care if you're killing them for food or for entertainment or for whatever other reason. They just want to be left alone. So, but I think in a way, I also was not resistant because I had always felt affinity for those who are vulnerable, and even like people. And I think it has to do with like the way I was raised and what I had to live through, and as I grew up. Like, I was more like a lot of people go into veganism from the animal perspective, and then they turn into and learn more about like social justice issues. I was coming from the other side. I was more aware of social justice issues in my own country before I even thought about animals, and then so I had always had that like empathy for the weak. So it was very easy for me to expand that to include animals.
And in one of the pieces you sent me, you have described violence in Colombia, social injustice, as not as isolated events, but almost like a background noise, part of daily life. Could you maybe paint a picture for our listeners? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I grew up in the 1980s and 90s, which are probably two of the most violent decades in Colombia. We had like many things going on, but the main two things that happened when I was growing up was like there was an armed conflict between communist guerrillas, or what used to be communist guerrillas, and the government. And then there was the drug war. The drug war had escalated quite a bit in the 80s and 90s, and so there was a lot of violence around related to that. It's so constant that you stop thinking about it. Like, I remember thinking, we cannot. When the drug war was kind of out of control, like early 90s, so I must have been like 11, 12 years old. You cannot stop and think, which car is going to blow up this time, because they were putting a lot of car bombs in the city. You wouldn't go crazy. You would never leave your house. So you just go and hope that it's not your turn. And you kind of like stop thinking about it. It becomes like very normalized. And I especially remember September 11th, 2001, because I had a friend who was from New York, was living in New York City at the time. And this person was completely distraught about what had happened. I remember trying to comfort this person just by saying, well, just just keep going, like tomorrow is just another day. And they couldn't comprehend that. And that's when I started thinking, not everybody lives like this. Not everybody deals with this kind of violence day in and day out, and just keep going. So yeah, that's kind of like how I grew up, and there was a lot of violence in the countryside. The guerrillas were fighting the government. The government also sought help from paramilitary groups, which increased the amount of violence, tenfold in the late 90s. So yeah, we unfortunately went through a lot during that time.
And you wrote that being surrounded by these kind of extreme human violence can make someone less repulsed by animal cruelty than, people in safer environments. How did you notice that in yourself or in others? I cannot even fathom, how hard it is to try to do vegan advocacy in that kind of environment, or just speaking to people who has been through that levels of trauma.
Yeah, so I noticed that first in myself. I went vegan without ever looking at footage of a farm or a slaughterhouse. Nothing. It was just like in my head, I made this decision that this was the right thing to do. When I started trying to do advocacy, then I started looking at videos. I started of farms and slaughterhouses, and I realized that I didn't feel anything. Like I could watch it like it was watching anything else. And in the beginning, I thought it was due because of the fact that I was already vegan, so that it didn't affect me. But then I really started thinking about it when I went to PETA, to the headquarters back in like 2002. And I was doing volunteer work as an intern. And they showed us a documentary that was very graphic. And they were boiling this cat alive in some market somewhere for food. And people in the room who were already vegan couldn't even look at it. They were crying. And I sat there and I was like, I don't feel anything about, like, there's something missing. So I was very desensitized to violence towards animals because I had been desensitized to violence towards humans for a very long time.
So when you speak with people who had also lived through these extreme violence, cartel violence, etc., how do they respond in general, to the idea of not eating animals? You see there's a level of horror, people perceive human horror or human oppression and then animal oppression. Do they, explicitly say, I can't think about animals right now? Like, why do I even care about animals when you can see human body parts laying around? Or
Yeah, totally. Like that happened all the time. Every time we were trying to do outreach, people, even my own family, I remember my mom just telling me, like, how can you care about a cow when, like, there's people getting killed? And it really bothered it. To be honest, it really bothered me because I didn't have an answer. Like, how do I tell people that we should care about both things? But I understood where they were coming from. They were like, a lot of people were in survival mode. So to ask them to care about animals, it was like a step too far. And that's how I ended up doing the work that I do about relating the war to animal rights, because I was really bothered by the fact that I didn't have an answer to this question. And I looked online and I asked people around, and I found, the normal, the more typical answers, compassion is not a zero-sum game and things like that. But it didn't really resonate with me to tell somebody that answer. And that's how I started relating and investigating how is the war, how is what we have lived through, is this related to what we do to animals in some way? And once I found that link, then I could tell them, yeah, you should care about animals, because if you care about what's happening in the countryside, in this country where, like, there's all this violence is partly and mostly caused by what we do to animals in the first place. And then I think people found that more relatable than just me. If I go tell them, animals feel pain and all these other things. That's true, but it's not enough to make them really question what they're doing. So yeah, that's how I approached it.
When we're thinking about veganism discourse in the West or even in China, there's a lot of talk about carbon footprint of beef production. But there is body counts, there's human lives behind beef production as well. And I would like to zoom out to that bigger picture for this part of our conversations, because in your article, you have mentioned connections between the drug trade, land reforms, and animal agriculture in Colombia. And for listeners who are not familiar with that story, could you give us a crash course? Could you sketch out how these things are connected?
Yeah, so it really begins way back when, Europeans came over to what is now Colombia. The way it was a big land grab. Europeans came and basically said, this land belongs to nobody. So whatever they found became their property. And if you fast forward that process, 400 years, 500 years, what happens is land ownership in Central South America is very skewed, which means that a very small amount of people own most of the land. And that's why there is so much poverty in the countryside, because most farmers and peasants, they don't even own the lands that they work. And in Colombia especially, that's a really bad problem. I think Colombia has the worst land ownership distribution of all Central South America. It became such a problem that in the 1960s, these rebel groups were formed. And one of their main objectives was to ask the government to redistribute the land so that peasants could own some land, so they could work basically for themselves, not for somebody else. And so the government fought them, because it was like the Cold War. And so it was like communists versus capitalists. And obviously the United States was involved in that, dictating policy. And well, over time, because of a U.S. demand that the government should promote the creation of self-defense groups or paramilitary forces, because they saw that the Colombian government was too weak to have a state presence everywhere in Colombia, in the countryside. So they said, you gotta promote people to create their own armies. A paramilitary force is basically just a private army. And that got out of control, and finally all these groups coalesced in one big group that was called the AUC, which stands in Spanish, but which stands for United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia. And there was a right-wing group, and they were very, very violent. It only existed for about 9 years officially. And in those 9 years, they were responsible for almost 50% of the victims in the Colombian armed conflict, which has lasted decades. So they were very violent, and they were basically sponsored by the cattle industry. Cattle ranchers were founding these groups, giving them money, getting them trained, because they saw land redistribution as their main enemy. They don't want to give up their lands that are mostly used in Colombia for cattle ranching. So 80% of agricultural land in Colombia is used for cattle ranching. So it's either grazing or raising crops to feed animals and so on. And these lands are owned by a very select and powerful group of people. So they saw any change as a threat, and they sponsored these groups that just went on to kill hundreds of thousands of people.
So would you say that peasants are being caught in the crossfire between the state, cartels, and agribusiness, and animal agriculture sort of function as a cover for economic activities or land grabbing in that conflict? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, so peasants are. I remember this quote I read once, and it said, peasants in Colombia are victims of everybody who has guns. That is true. you have the government and the paramilitaries on one side, and the guerrillas on the other side. And that's a complicated subject, and a lot of people tend to. It's debatable whether communist guerrillas in Colombia are still communist or are still even fighting for the people. We can elaborate more about that if we want, but there, people that just want to work and live in peace, they're victims there. They caught in like this very complex conflict, and then you have the drug part of everything in because drug trafficking is very profitable. So everybody is involved in drug trafficking just because they want to fund their own groups. That's how it works. So you have guerrillas, right-wing paramilitaries, everybody traffics drugs. Then you have the actual drug cartels, which all they care is about making money. They don't really have political aims other than being left alone so they can get rich. And the peasants are just in the middle.
What's so special about cattle ranching that would work in this kind of conflict? And also, what these cattle are raised for? Are they exporting? They're exporting the cattle somewhere else, or what are the kind of economic functions of the cattle in ranching in Colombia?
Yeah, so cattle ranching, is by area is the biggest thing in Colombia. There is if you looked at a map, most of eastern Colombia, basically from the end of the mountains all the way to Venezuela, is like cattle grazing lands because it's just flat. So it's grasslands that have been used for cattle ranching for centuries. And then also northern Colombia, it's also very flat, and that's also used for cattle ranching. And most of the cattle in Colombia ends up in Colombia, but there is exports, and there is also live exports, which are terrible. So Colombia live exports cows to all the way to Jordan, for example.
It's called the ship of death.
Yeah,
or
it's called
something.
the ship of death. Yeah. So they load up these ships with live cattle. They take almost 30 days to reach Jordan, at which point they just get unloaded and slaughtered. So it's a terrible thing. It's hard to imagine what these cows go through in that month. I mean, let alone their whole lives, but that month just sounds like absolutely terrible. But yeah, so and obviously the cattle ranchers have a lot of political power too. So that's so a lot of the economy is geared towards benefiting them and their business. So yeah, that's kind of like the big picture of how cattle ranching works in Colombia.
But I was more curious about like who brought up this idea of having such a large-scale cattle ranching to begin with. Have you investigated that?
Yeah, so that was also that's a product of like being a Spanish colony for so long. So they brought their own. We raised cattle that was brought from Europe. And it's actually interesting. Most all of the three main species that humans consume, cows, chickens, and pigs, were all brought to the Americas by Europeans. They did not exist. We didn't have cows in Colombia. They were all brought from Europe. So they created this practice, and they just took advantage of the fact that they believed that land belonged to no one. It was up for grabs, and that's how they ended up owning huge swaths of land, so they can produce raise all these cattle. Now, one difference that I see between how cattle is raised in Colombia and in other places is that Colombia practices what they call extensive animal agriculture, not intensive. So you don't see these lots filled with as many cows as possible. What you see is huge lands with cows, but they almost roam free for until they get ready to be slaughtered. But so that's why also it takes a lot more area and a lot more resources to do it that way than we have those intensive, like a factory farm. That's just for cows. Like pigs and chickens raised in Colombia are raised in factory farms like they are in the rest of the world.
Do you see the cattle ranching business creating like a demand, like an augmented demand in the public? For example, trying to increase the beef intake in the population?
Well, in Colombia, eating lots of beef is seen as a status thing because it's expensive compared to fruits and vegetables. And it's that took me a while to understand because, for example, here where I live in the U.S., it's the opposite. Like meat is really cheap, and then you go buy like fruits and vegetables; they're more expensive. But in Colombia, it was always the opposite. And I remember when I stopped eating meat, a lot of people would tell me, like you're gonna get sick if you don't eat meat and all this. There was all this like propaganda going on. And I remember I used to tell them, yeah, but there's people in this country who don't eat meat because they can't afford it, and they're fine. So it's not really, you don't really need this to survive. But yeah, so they have there's a cattle ranchers federation, and they do a lot of propaganda about like the quality of the beef and how good it is for you and things like that. And they actually and a lot of people involved in that cattle ranchers federation. Some of them, there was this guy, he was the head of it. He's now in prison for having links to paramilitary groups. So it's not as what I tell people about what happens in Colombia. Yes, the cattle ranchers federation is run by people who have links to paramilitary groups, and some of those people are in prison now because of that. So when I tell people in Colombia, like this is who you support really when you eat meat. You're not just supporting the death of animals or the exploitation of animals. You're supporting the people who are responsible for a lot of the violence we see. And that's not a secret. I'm not telling them something they haven't heard of before. They just haven't really thought about it. But everybody knows that these people are involved in these very awful things.
And what are the environmental groups doing to prevent extensive animal agriculture? Are they doing any effective initiatives in Colombia in the last decade or so?
No, I don't think so. I don't think they're that effective. They're trying to prevent more land for being cleared for cattle ranching. I think they fail because the cattle ranchers just basically do whatever they want, and they have the political power to get away with it. So we have, for example, in common with Brazil, a lot of our Amazon jungle is being clear cut to either grow crops to feed cattle or to graze cattle. And so that just keeps on going. There's been talks about how, and for many years, I remember there had been talks about like how they need to rotate the lands that they use. So the environmentalists say, yeah, grazing cattle depletes the land, and the solution is for you to start using different parts of the land so that the soil can recover. But nobody's really saying, well, maybe we shouldn't be raising all these cattle. Like they just, it's a given that the cattle exists, and there's nothing we can do about it, which I think is a big failure.
And why do you think they skip that most important step, the root cause of the problem? Is it because the vested interest or some other reasons?
Well, I think there is some of that, some of vested interests that prevent people from speaking out, and it's also culturally. Colombian food is very meat centered, so culturally they just see it as this is just the way it is. So there's nothing we can do about it. We need to eat meat because that's what we have done forever. So that's why I think a lot of people make connections with environmental destruction, but they still eat meat all the time.
I'm curious whether there are international groups because, you like you mentioned, parts of it's also connect to Amazon. And I think, internationally, there has been lots of attention with regards to preventing deforestation, preventing the situation from getting worse. But I just think about in China, we don't really, the general public don't really like to hear that it is because we eating beef, eating meat that's causing deforestation in the Amazon. I wonder if there's similar shared kind of defensiveness in the general public when you're, say, for example, when international environmental groups point out there's a correlation between deforestation and meat consumption.
Yeah, there is definitely a resistance between those two things, because, and I think for a few reasons. One is like obviously people are going to get defensive when you're told that what you're doing is wrong, and they just say, well, it's just me. Like, what difference does it make if me personally I stopped eating meat or not? So that is one thing. The other thing that I think, at least in Colombia specifically, is if the information comes from outside, there is a resistance to it, and it could be, and that is for almost everything related to what happens in Colombia. Like, people were very resistant to believe that the government or like the army had links to paramilitary groups and all this, because there were issues that were raised by, for example, a report from human rights organizations that are from outside of Colombia. So a lot of people will be like, well, they don't know how it is here. They're just talking about things that they don't know. And it was only after it became so widespread that people started believing, yes, obviously these two things are related. So I think it's also that when it comes to the environment, if you have like a big group from outside, let's say Greenpeace or somebody like that, comes and tells people in Colombia, hey, you're causing all this deforestation, the people tend to be more resistant because it's not a group from inside that's saying it.
Well, we can circle back to the advocacy later. When you're starting the ethical vegan organization in Colombia, what kind of audience were you trying to reach at that time? Were they mostly urban citizens, or people who are, I don't know, like students or activists from other movements? What was your approach at the beginning?
Yeah, so in the beginning, and this was very intentional from from my friend and I who started this organization. We didn't want it to be limited to any. We thought we want anybody to think that they can do this. So we didn't want to be affiliated with like, we didn't reach out to like activist circles or anything. We just like general public, and we lived in the city, so it was urban. But we would go where like there was a lot of like offices, and there was a lot of foot traffic, just people working there, and we would give leaflets. And yes, in the beginning we did make a mistake. I remember the first leaflets we ever gave out were made by PETA. They sent it to us. But they were in Spanish, and very quickly somebody turned around and told us, this is sad, but this doesn't happen here. It says it's in the United States. And I said, well, that makes sense. We actually don't know anything about what happens in Colombia. We didn't have any numbers. Like if somebody asked us, well, how many animals do they kill in Colombia in a year? I didn't have an answer. We didn't know. So we had to sit down and do all this research. Or, if somebody asked, well, what does a Colombian egg farm look like? a slaughterhouse. Like we didn't know. We had to go find out. So yeah, so that was our first approach, was like urban population, but it was just like the general public. We didn't want to be restricted to any circles or any subcultures or anything like that.
And were you trying to form alliance with human rights groups or, I don't know, peasant movements, environmental organizations?
No, we did not try that. We were kind of on our own in that regard. In the beginning, it was very limiting because we were not sure if we would be safe. I remember we had a meeting, and at this point, it was more than just my friend and I. It was like we were maybe 8 people working on this group, and we had a meeting, and we said, because we were going to launch a website, and we decided it had to be anonymous because we were talking about things that, like, these groups, these paramilitary groups funded by cattle ranchers, they don't care about killing one more person. They've killed thousands of people already. So we couldn't do any public events. Website didn't have anybody's name, like nothing. It was all, and so it was very limiting what we could do. It was just over time we relaxed a little bit. So what happened was somebody found out our website, and it was a journalist, and they wrote us and they said, this is very new, like nobody kind of understood what we were trying to talk about, so they wanted to interview us to figure out, what are you guys talking about. And we decided to go to the interview. So then it became public, like this is like these 2 people, these are our names and all that. And then we didn't hear anything. Like we got like hate mail, but we didn't receive any threats. So we thought, well, maybe this will be okay. And then we started doing more public events and screening of like movies or documentaries, or we gave talks at like schools and things like that. And we personally never received threats. Now, we were right about the fact that at some point, the cattle ranchers were going to start to listen to what we were saying. And as the movement grew bigger and there were more organizations, at some point they did, some people that I know personally did get death threats telling them they had to stop talking about these things. So yeah, that makes activism in Colombia very unique, or in that regard. But I know that like activists in all places, they're talking about capitalist interests, and you're just one activist. They don't. These people don't care about killing one more person.
Yeah. Environmental activists, also indigenous environmental activists being killed is also growing, I think, in Latin America and other parts of the world. But when you mentioned like the cattle ranchers, when they are being affected, have you heard any case where they made the transition? Any successful cases?
What do you mean made the transition?
Oh, I mean like stop cattle ranching, like abandoning their practice. Have there been ever been a case?
Not in Colombia. I don't know of any case that anybody has stopped farming animals.
So this is kind of makes me think about the law, the legislation, because as far as I know, in 2016, Colombia has passed the law where it acknowledged animals are sentient beings and no longer objects. So how does that translate into real life practices when it comes to humans' treatments of animals? Does it ever affect animal agriculture?
It doesn't, and I think it's a expression of speciesism, right? It's like people like to think about sentient beings as like your cat, your dog, maybe a horse, but when it comes to the animals in a farm or in a slaughterhouse, they stop thinking about it. They feel like, well, that's just the way it is. But that law and a few other pieces of legislation have been very crucial into advancing some of the things that we have seen in Colombia. Like Colombia later passed an animal cruelty law that would punish people that were cruel to animals, and it was basically written to prevent cruelty to pets. That was basically what the aim was. But it was argued successfully that if the law if these cruel practices were unlawful, then things like bullfighting were unlawful, were cruelty to animals, and they were technically illegal by this law. And that opened the door for the debate about banning bullfighting, which was finally successful last year, and they banned it. Then it was challenged in court that the ban was unconstitutional, and it went all the way to the Colombian Supreme Court. And I was very happy because the Colombian Supreme Court not only said that the ban was lawful and they upheld the ban, but then they actually said, well, if we're going to ban this, then we have to ban other things too. So they extended the ban to other things automatically, like cockfighting is now illegal in Colombia, which was just was not even part of that campaign. It's just the court decided this makes sense. So there is some progress, yeah, but when it comes to animals in farms, there is this divide in people's heads that they just don't count. And it's sad, but I think hopefully someday we'll see that go away.
Coming from China is already very impressive because we have the similar issues where people are using. So we're trying to push again this year for animal cruelty law to be actually taken into consideration by the state constitution. But there are lots of people also using speciesism as an argument against having an animal cruelty law, because they think, first of all, you guys only care about cute animals. This is actually, animal cruelty against cute animals. You don't care about other animals. And the second thing is, how this might affect so many other businesses in China, because how do you define what animals are included in the scope of these kind of law? I'm also very interested in who's behind legislative change in Colombia, especially I think in 2016. Do you know who's behind these change?
So what happened was that there was a transition in which a lot of animal activists went into politics, and they were successful in getting elected, and then they passed, they worked together to pass all these laws. Like one of them is an activist that I've known for a long time. She was the spokesperson for one organization it's probably the biggest animal rights organization in Colombia right now, mostly because they're almost like a chapter of an organization based in Spain, so they have a lot of resources. But besides the point, she was the spokesperson and made the transition into politics successfully. And that happened not just with her, but with other people. And then they worked together to pass these laws. And they're a little bit diluted in the sense that nobody's really talking about, or the politicians are not really talking about animal liberation or things like that. They're just saying this is cruel and we're going to pass this law. And they're not really advocating publicly for veganism or anything like that. A lot of them are vegan themselves, but they don't really say this is why we're doing it. So it's a way to get people thinking, and I think that's what has been successful there. And it had also there's a lot of compromise too going on, like the ban, like the bullfighting ban, had to be. There's a transition period which is going to last 3 years, because the argument is that by banning bullfighting, you're preventing people from working, and and then they don't have jobs, so they have to transition them into let's go in, get trained or find a different job. So they cannot just like cut it off. And that's a compromise, because obviously we as animal activists, we would like the bullfight to end tomorrow and that's it, close the place and call it a day. But that's not the way the real world works, and so you have to find ways to compromise.
Could you tell us the name of that politician, the friend of yours? Maybe I can Google her.
Andrea Padilla, that's her name.
Okay.
She was the spokesperson for Anima Naturalis, which was is a organization based in Spain, but they have a chapter or in Colombia that has been very successful. Is much better known than, like, for example, my organization ever was, which and it has to do with the fact that, like, obviously they're externally funded, so they can do way more things that we could. But to their credit, they have talked about things like the links between the war in Colombia and cattle ranching. So it's not completely a one issue organization. They have talked about things that are important, and I give them credit for that.
And would you consider going to politics one of the most effective ways to make systemic change for animal activists?
No, I don't think politics is the best way to create systemic change. I believe more in community building and building things from the ground up. Like, I don't think, and I think if we all did that on our own space, at some point we see changes in the world. Like, I don't need to try to change the world. I need to try to change the environment around me. So, like, my own community, and that's vague, but my community could be, I don't know, for example, the building I live in, or my neighborhood, like something small. I'm way more effective at trying to change that than trying to change, the laws in a country. So I believe more in that politics.
Mm. And how would you describe the animal rights community in Colombia, especially in comparison with the time when you started animal advocacy and what it has been through in the last, I think, more than 2 decades now, right? Because you started as a vegan very early on. So how do the community look like now in Colombia? Are there a lot of animal rights activists?
Yeah. So there is quite a few animal rights activists in Colombia, but things have changed a lot. One is that at some point, in 2006, the AUC, that paramilitary group, was disbanded, and they went into a peace process with the government. Now, we can talk about whether that's legitimate or fair or not, but technically it ended. And then in 2016, there was the peace accords with the FARC, which was the biggest guerrilla group. So for the last almost decade, they have considered Colombia to be in peace. That is not necessarily true, but what it does mean is that the internal conflict has de-escalated quite a bit. So there is a lot less talk about the links between war and Colombia. There is some, but the mainstream organizations seem to talk about it less. Also, with the proliferation of social media, then I see things that don't make a lot of sense in Colombia, because they're doing activism that works in other places, but not necessarily there. The best example is that Anonymous for the Voiceless has a chapter in Colombia, and they do cubes of truth in some cities. And I think this doesn't make a lot of sense to do in Colombia, because this is a country where people with masks are usually doing things that are not good. it usually means trouble, and usually means like lethal trouble. It means like somebody's gonna die. So I'm like, I look at that and I think like, they're not really having any effect. They're probably having the opposite effect that they want. People probably don't want to talk to them. They feel like something bad's gonna happen. But these are very young activists that did not live through what people like me had to live. And they don't understand, the background of like, if you try to talk to somebody while wearing a mask, that's not gonna work. But it's what they see on social media, so it tries to be replicated.
And another thing I noticed was when I tried to search the keyword veganism and Colombia on YouTube, all I can see are videos about eating at vegan restaurants.
Yeah.
I couldn't even find a video about like a serious talk about veganism or vegan movement in Colombia.
Yeah, that is unfortunately true. So there is sadly, and I think it's the same effect of like, and I see the same effect almost everywhere, is that veganism has been reduced to a diet, and it has been reduced to like food. And that happens in Colombia. It happens here where I live. And in Colombia especially, there is because fruits and vegetables are so easily found, there is this proliferation of vegan food everywhere. But a lot of it is devoid of that talk about animals. It's more like health, or just like it's trendy, and that's what it is. But yeah, I see that all the time. It's a little frustrating, to be honest.
Yeah. But I wonder, what's your opinion when, people who are promoting plant-based diet, campaigns like veganuary, or, eating plant-based meal once every week or something, these reductivist approach to veganism, right? Because I think a lot of people would say, well, why does it matter? Because eventually people are eating less meat. So why do you want to politicize it? Why do you want to bring animal into the conversation and make people uncomfortable? How would you respond to that?
What I would say is that there is a misguided belief, or this misguided idea among people, especially some vegans, unfortunately, that because you don't eat meat one meal or one day, then somehow you saved an animal. And that is not true. Whether you stop eating meat for one meal or one day, the animals are still being slaughtered. So I think that like we should try to change people's mindset about animals, and then that leads naturally to thinking about not eating animals. I think just telling people don't eat animals but don't change anything else about your life doesn't do much, because it's not really a core belief. Then a lot of people change over time, and they can just go back to eating meat. I think the simplest example is people who are vegan for their health, or they eat plant-based for their health. It's very easy for them to say, well, maybe I don't care about my health today, so I'm going to go eat meat today. And in their heads, that's fine. But if they had changed their mindset or how they view animals, they probably wouldn't take that so lightly and think, well, I'm going to eat animals today because somehow I don't care about animals today. Like, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So it's harder for people to take it so lightly.
Yeah, it's very frustrating, because here in China, I also see there are so many plant-based quote unquote movement, and it's just so hard. Like, people are so used to, demoralize veganism, and I realize we're hitting like an hour mark. So I want to end our conversation with something a bit more personal and a bit more optimistic, maybe. First of all, I want to know, like, how do you stay sane? Any, I don't know, practices, like personal, collective, spiritual, whatever, that help you stay emotionally functional while working on such a heavy topic?
Yeah, I remember there is something I tell myself all the time. I think that helps a lot. And is that, like, yes, there is a lot of violence in the world and a lot of ugly things. I think you should be proud of the fact that you are trying your best not to participate, not to be a part of that. That doesn't mean you're going to stop it, but that it just means that like you are trying. And that keeps me sane because, for example, now that it's close to like the holidays, right? Like the end of Christmas and all that, and people eat a lot of animals. A lot of vegans I know, they're like, this is very sad. I struggle with this time of year. And I tell them, turn it around. Tell yourself, yes, this is happening, but I'm not a part of it. And that's a good thing. Turn it into something positive. So that's how I stay sane. Also, I believe a lot in community. So like, if you feel sad, if you feel like overwhelmed, if you're approaching like burnout, talk to other people about it. Don't think that because you're an activist you have to be invincible. And especially because if you burn yourself out, it's not just going to be, oh, I'm going to take 1 day break. Once people reach burnout, you may lose an activist for like years before, or maybe forever, before they decide to come back. So I'm always like, yeah, let's talk about these things among ourselves. We don't need to keep it. Let's keep it honest. This is hard, and it's harder for some than for others. But if we all take care of each other, we'll be a lot better than if we pretend that we're all perfect. Yeah.
I suddenly realized I forgot to mention Spinoza because you're a huge fan of him. And for me personally, reading philosophy is definitely also a source of comfort because I realized all the really horrible things, people have been through it and all of the difficult questions they have been asked before by these really amazing thinkers. I really appreciate Spinoza's work as well. But he also has a pretty anthropocentric, well, he's less anthropocentric than most philosophers of that time, but he's also considered animals as below humans. So what do you think about that? And how does that affect you?
Yeah. So I think that like, unfortunately, everybody's a victim of their
Time.
own time. So at the time Spinoza was alive, there was this Cartesian belief, right? That like animals are just like a bio machine. They have no soul, and they don't deserve any ethical consideration. Now, I would like to think that if Spinoza was alive today, and he had the knowledge that we have of all the science, we have hundreds of years now of evolutionary biology telling us differently about animals, right? Maybe he will reach a different conclusion. So I like Spinoza, but I don't believe in dogma either. So I disagree with some of the things he said. But for me, Spinoza is most important is because he doesn't believe in good and evil. Like good and evil are very subjective, right? But he believes in the doctrine of necessity. So what's necessary exists, and what's not necessary should not exist. So I think about that, and I think, well, then causing unnecessary suffering cannot be ethical. It's something that should not be happening. Just because we can do it doesn't mean we should be doing it. And that explains a lot of behaviors to me. Wild animals behave differently than we do because they have to do things differently than we do. As vegans, we're all told all the time, oh, well, lions kill other animals. I'm like, yes, because they have to. If they don't do it, they die. We don't go and sit at a restaurant and think, if I don't eat this right now, I'm going to die. Like, we have options. And that's why we should choose the most ethical option, which is the one that causes the least amount of suffering. Yeah, but so he was not perfect by any means. I also disagree with him about being rational all the time. I think he missed a very human experience, which that of falling in love, which is one of the most irrational things you can ever do, and but it brings a lot of happiness. So I disagree with him on that, but yeah, I like his worldview in the sense that like is way more objective than like other philosophers. Like I can almost make links between scientific knowledge and ethical knowledge directly. And so I like that.
I'm still a learner of Spinoza's philosophy, but I really liked the affective dimension as well. Even though you said he also had a very strong focus on being rational, but then the power of merely existing, the sad and joy, he really opened my mind when it comes to what kind of power induce joy and sad. And that is something that a lot of the political philosophers don't like to talk about, the emotions in the power. But anyway, we can have another discussion about all these philosophy. I wonder if you could give us maybe your Instagram handle or any other places where people can follow your work, look at your investigations, etc.
Yes, I have an Instagram account, and my handle it's in Spanish, and it's Soy Espinosista, which means I'm a Spinozist in Spanish. That's how you can find me, and I have a link there to I have a blog on Medium, which is the same username. I don't write a lot, but I write like very short things sometimes, and I have copies of articles that I've published in other places linked there. And yeah, those are the two main ways to find me.
And what are you working on now these days?
Right now, I'm not working on anything new. I've been thinking about doing some like reels that are shorter and more concise about these links between war and animal rights, especially in Colombia and in other places. But I haven't gotten around to it yet. I don't work in activism, like I have a regular job, so this is just like my free time. That it takes me a while to put something together.
Thank you, Fernando, for sharing all this with us. And I know it's not easy to revisit some of these stories. And I really hope that people listening will sit with the discomfort and think about what animal ethics or animal liberation means in the middle of human oppression and human violence. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me.
你现在正在收听的是有点豆腐，一个倡导动物权利的播客。你可以在小宇宙、豆瓣、Apple Podcast、YouTube 和 Spotify 找到我们。想看文字版本的内容，请访问 slightlytofu.github.io， 也欢迎你投稿给我们。我们的邮箱是 slightlytofu@proton.me。感谢你的聆听与支持，让我们一起行动，让动物不再是商品。